Welcome back. If you, like us, are fascinated by ecosystems and how invasive species can really shake things up, you know there's a ton of research out there. But today, we're doing something a bit different. We're not just looking at the impact of invaders, we're taking a deep dive into how scientists actually study those impacts. We're getting into a really interesting meta-analysis by Robert Crystal-Ornelas and Julie L. Lockwood from 2020. It's called The Known Unknowns of Invasive Species Impact Measurement. And that title, Known Unknowns, that's really the key, isn't it? It borrows from the Johari window concept.
Exactly. It's usually from social science, but they use it brilliantly here. It frames the core question. What do scientists studying invasions know they don't know? Where are the blind spots in our own research efforts? And this paper, well, it really hits on a major issue in invasion ecology. There's a lot of interest, scientifically and publicly, because these species cause, significant harm. We've got over 30 different hypotheses trying to explain how they have these impacts. But the authors here argue that the actual evidence we're using to test these big ideas is too patchy, too fragmented.
Fragmented how exactly?
Well, the data we gather seems to be collected selectively, maybe based on what's easiest to measure rather than what's most important ecologically. And if that's true, our ability to really understand, predict, and manage invasions is, well, it's limited.
Okay, let's unpack this then. The paper's mission, as I understand it, was to quantify how the research itself, the evidence, is spread out, looking at things like different biological levels from genes to whole ecosystems across time, main habitats, different species. Is that right?
That's spot on. They wanted a bird's eye view of the research landscape itself.
So how did they get this view? Sounds like a massive job.
Oh, it was. It was a huge systematic review. They sifted through thousands of articles published between 1999 and 2016. In the end, they built this database from over 1,500 research papers that actually reported quantified impacts, nearly 2 decades of invasion science.
And they had strict rules for what got included.
Very strict. They used standard protocols like PICO and PRISMA to make sure the quality was there. And crucially, it had to be original research done in a natural system, so no lab experiments or farms. And importantly, it needed a number. A quantified measurement of the impact, not just, a description.
Okay, so quantifiable data from real-world ecosystems. And how did they organize all that information?
They developed a clear framework. They grouped the ecological effects, things like changes in animal behavior or shifts in species diversity, or even changes in soil nutrients, into about 11 types. And then, this is key, they linked each measured effect to one of 5 biological scales.
Right, the scales. Can you quickly run through those for us, from smallest to biggest?
Sure. So the smallest level, you've got the genetic scale. Think hybridization, things happening at the DNA level between invaders and natives. Then the individual scale, maybe changes in growth rate or how an individual native animal behaves. Then population scale. This is about numbers, abundance, survival rates, that sort of thing.
Right.
Then community scale, that's looking at the mix of species. Diversity, species richness.
Then the biggest?
The ecosystem scale. This is the really broad stuff, altering nutrient cycles, changing fire patterns, physically reshaping the habitat. Big picture changes.
Got it. That framework makes sense. And I imagine the time element was just as critical. How long studies ran for?
Absolutely crucial. An impact measure today might look very different in 10 or 20 years. So they looked at study duration, how often samples were taken, and really importantly, whether the study even reported when the invasion started, the time since invasion.
And I'm guessing what they found there wasn't great.
No. It leads straight into their first really big finding. The research effort is massively skewed by biological scale. We're just not looking evenly across those 5 levels.
So where is most of the research focused?
Overwhelmingly, the measurements pile up at the population scale that had over 1,000 measurements.
Wow.
And the community scale, which had over 600, we seem to be really good at, or at least really focused on, counting things, counting individuals, counting species.
Which I suppose is often the most straightforward thing to measure, right? Easier to get funding for, maybe quicker to publish.
That's likely a big part of it. It points towards a sort of convenience bias in the science. We measure what's accessible.
But the implication is we're potentially missing the bigger picture or the finer details.
Exactly. When you look at the other end of the spectrum, the genetic scale or the individual level impacts or those huge ecosystem level changes, the data is much, much thinner, scarce, really.
So major blind spots at the very small and very large scales.
Precisely. We might be missing key mechanisms happening at the genetic level, or fundamentally misunderstanding the long-term environmental shifts at the ecosystem level.
Okay, so what we measure is skewed. You mentioned the time element earlier. This is where it gets really interesting, you said.
Yeah, this temporal bias is, I think, maybe the most startling finding. It really highlights a vulnerability in the field.
How bad is it?
You'll get this. Two-thirds. Fully two-thirds of all the published impact studies, they looked at measured effects over 1 year or less.
1 year. That's incredibly short for ecological processes. Things like evolution or big shifts in nutrients, they take way longer than that.
Right. It's barely a blink in ecological time. And it gets even more concerning.
How so?
A full half of all the impact measurements came from a single sampling event, just one point in time, a snapshot.
So we're essentially judging a long movie based on a single frame for half the data points.
That's a great way to put it. We're making these broad inferences about dynamic long-term processes based often on these very short one-off looks.
Now, someone listening might think, okay, but long-term studies are expensive, hard to fund. Isn't this just reflecting the reality of research grants?
That's definitely a factor, and the authors acknowledge the funding challenge. But it crosses the line into a scientific problem for a couple of reasons. First, the poor reporting. Even with short studies, you need context. But they found that half of the papers didn't even report the year the invasive species was first introduced in that country.
Which means,
Which means you can't even begin to assess how impacts might change over time, even if your study was short. You lose that vital time since invasion context.
okay, so even basic reporting is missing sometime.
Yeah. And second, they point out that there are research designs that can help get around funding limits for long-term work. Things like revisiting old study sites years later, or using space-for-time substitution studying areas invaded at different times. But these clever, more affordable long-term approaches, they were barely used, found at only like 1 or 2% of the studies. So it's not just funding, it's also about the research designs we choose or fail to choose.
Okay, so we've got biases in biological scale and a huge bias towards short-term snapshots. What about which species and where we study them? Is the focus skewed there too?
Yep, another layer of fragmentation. The paper highlights that most published impact data comes from one-off studies of single invasive species. There isn't much synthesis across species or locations.
So we study one species here, another one there, but don't connect the dots often.
Pretty much. And this leads to a definite taxonomic bias. Out of nearly 600 unique invasive species they found data for, the research heavily focuses on plants, fish, and insects.
And what about other groups?
Birds, amphibians, reptiles, much less represented in terms of measured impacts. And for most of the species that are studied, maybe they only have 1 or 2 impact measurements recorded in the literature, ever. It's incredibly piecemeal.
Wow. So even for species we think we know well, the picture might be incomplete. You mentioned the cane toad earlier as an example.
Yeah, the cane toad's a perfect case study here. Rhinella marina is one of the top 3 most measured species in their whole data set. 50 separate case studies reporting impacts. Sounds pretty comprehensive, right?
It does, yeah. 50 studies.
But when Crystal-Ornelas and Lockwood broke it down by biological scale, despite those 50 studies covering 4 different scales,
Let me guess.
there were 0 published studies quantitatively measuring its impact at the ecosystem scale.
Seriously. For the cane toad.
Yeah.
After all this time and study, no data on how it changes the whole ecosystem.
None that met their criteria for quantified impact measurement. We know it eats a lot, we know it affects predator populations, but how it might change nutrient cycling, soil, the broader habitat structure, that data apparently wasn't published between 1999 and 2016.
That's actually shocking.
It really is. And contrast that with the only species in their top 10 most studied list that did have impacts measured across all 5 biological scales. The rainbow trout, Oncorhynchus mykiss.
So one species gets the full workup, while even other famous invaders have these huge gaps. The research effort is just wildly uneven.
Exactly. And that unevenness extends to geography, too. Where are these studies actually taking place?
Let me guess. Places that are easy to get to or places with a long history of introductions?
You got it. Nearly half of all the impact data came from forests, running waterlogged systems, and islands. Predictable hotspots.
Which means we're neglecting.
Other important environments, deserts, mountains, maybe tundra, other types of aquatic systems. Impacts are measured much less often there. So any general rules we think we've discovered about invasions might completely fall apart in those understudied ecosystems.
Yeah.
The context dependency is huge, but we're not exploring the full range of contexts.
Okay, so let's tie this all together. We have research that's skewed towards certain biological scales, heavily favors short-term snapshots, focuses on a few types of species, and concentrates on specific, perhaps convenient ecosystems. What does this mean for the big goals of invasion ecology, like prediction and understanding?
Well, it means those goals are harder to reach. The authors argue this skew isn't just, an academic detail, it's a fundamental impediment to synthesis. It actively holds the field back. And what's really novel, I think, is how they flip the perspective. Maybe the reason we don't have many big theories about, say, genetic impacts or long-term behavioral shifts isn't because those things aren't happening, aren't important.
But because we just haven't been looking for them. Our methods have biased us away from even asking those questions.
Precisely. It could be a product of decades of selectively measuring what's easiest: population numbers, community lists. We've trained ourselves to focus there, potentially missing other critical dynamics. And that short-term focus basically guarantees we can't properly test some of the really interesting longer-term hypotheses out there. Well, things like the evolution of increased competitive ability hypothesis, the idea that invaders become more competitive over generations in their new range, or ecosystem engineering, where invaders physically change the environment. These things take decades, potentially centuries, to play out fully. Our one-year snapshots just can't capture that.
And doesn't this reliance on short, often single studies also raise the risk of getting misleading early results? There's a term for that, isn't there?
Yes, the Codius phenomenon. It's the idea that the very first studies published on a new topic or maybe a new invasive species impact often report exaggerated effects.
Why would that happen?
It could be publication bias. Dramatic results are easier to get published quickly.
Yeah.
But if those initial, potentially inflated results aren't followed up by more careful long-term studies and replication, they can become cemented in the literature and mislead future research. Those one-off snapshots are particularly vulnerable to this.
So the lack of long-term follow-up makes the whole evidence base a bit shaky.
It certainly introduces that risk.
It really sounds like the core problems, the short timescales, the specific focus, are tied up with the realities of funding long ecological studies. It's just hard to do.
It is hard,
Mm.
absolutely. And the paper acknowledges that funding is a major constraint. You can't just wish multi-decade projects into existence easily.
Right.
But they also stress that the research community isn't powerless. There are ways forward.
Such as?
Things like fostering more international collaboration, pooling resources across countries and research groups can make longer-term, broader-scale studies more feasible, and also getting more creative with existing data, using historical records, museum collections, old monitoring data basically, leveraging information that's already been collected, sometimes decades ago, to get around the need for continuous new funding for long periods.
So it requires a shift in thinking, maybe, as much as a shift in funding.
I think that's a big part of their message, yes.
Okay, so the main takeaway here for you, our listener, seems to be this. The science we rely on to understand invasive species has some significant systemic biases. It's shaped by what's been convenient or traditional to study, and we really want to get better at predicting and managing invasions, understanding their impacts across all levels over meaningful timescales and in all sorts of environments. The research community needs to consciously address these known unknowns.
Right. It means deliberately shifting some focus away from just counting populations in forests and islands and putting more effort into those neglected scales, like genetics and ecosystems, and into those understudied environments, and definitely into finding ways to understand the long game. Embracing that context really matters.
Which leaves us with, I think, a pretty challenging final thought to mull over. If our current understanding of invasion impacts has been so heavily shaped by this focus on short-term population and community changes, what crucial, slow-burning impacts at the genetic level, or massive, decades-long shifts at the ecosystem level, things like widespread hybridization, irreversible changes to soil or water cycles, fundamental habitat restructuring, what if those things are already well underway, but we've barely even started to measure them?